that Jesus talked a lot about. And in fact, that he did a lot. We are here to eat a meal together. Now, I realize this is not a meal in the typical sense that we think of a meal. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I sit down to eat a meal, I expect there to be meat on the table, and there is no meat. And I at least hope that there will be dessert afterwards, and there is no dessert. But you know, that's not what the Lord chose for his people to eat when they gathered together to eat this supper. You know, the night that he instituted this, the night of Passover, he had a lot of options on the table before him. But the two things that he picked out for his people to use in this special Lord's Supper are the bread and the cup, the unleavened bread and the fruit of the vine. That's the humble elements that he intended to be used in the supper. On the other hand, in his teaching and even in his personal life, Jesus went to and told a lot of stories about lavish banquets. Like, for example, the parable of the wedding feast in Matthew 22. Or like his first recorded miracle in the Gospel of John, which took place at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. And there's a good reason why Jesus talked so much about great feasts and why he participated in so many of them. He was fulfilling the expectation of the Old Testament. Because when the prophets talked about what it would be like in the day when the Messiah came, they described the time of the Messiah as a great and lavish feast. Like the prophet Isaiah, for example, who says in Isaiah 25, "On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined." That's why Jesus gave so many parables about feasts. It's why Jesus went to so many feasts. He's doing exactly what the prophet said the Messiah would do and give when he came. But not everybody was happy about this. As we will see in the passage I want us to think about this morning, which is found in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke chapter 15. Listen to what the opening two verses of this chapter tell us. Luke 15, 1 and 2. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" The reason the scribes and the Pharisees are murmuring is not because of what Jesus is doing, but who he is doing it with. He is actually eating with tax gatherers, notorious for their collusion with the pagan Romans and their corruption in charging extra taxes. And then the sinners. Those are the people, where the Gospels describe them like this, who are non-observant Jews. They are Jews in name only. How could the Messiah be eating with these people? Well, Jesus has an answer to that question. And that answer takes the form of three stories found here in Luke 15. The first is the story of the lost sheep. The second is the story of the lost coin. And the third is the story that we usually call the prodigal son, but if you think about it, would make sense to call the lost son. You know these details very well. It starts like this in verse 11. "And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me.' And he divided his property between them." Now just think, under normal circumstances, when would a son receive his share of his inheritance from his father's estate? It would, of course, be when the father has passed away. Do you see then that when this younger son says, "Give me my share of the property coming to me," and since that would usually happen when the dad is dead, you can see what this son thinks about his father. It means, as far as he's concerned, his father might as well be dead to him, because he wants what would come to him when the father died. He wants his share of the property. He wants money. The actual life of the Father does not matter to him. That's why verse 12 uses a really interesting word. It's translated in my Bible as property. I don't give you a lot of Greek words, but you'll recognize this one. It would be spelled in our letters, B-I-O-S. It's where we get words like biography from. A biography is the story of a person's life. And this word meant a person's life, and then by extension, their livelihood, which is why it's translated property. But what it's really conveying to us is this: as far as the Son is concerned, the only value to his Father's life is his livelihood, his property. That is a cold and calculating and ruthless son. When my in-laws were in town, I hated to see them go. They left yesterday. We had a wonderful visit. And a couple nights ago, Thursday night, I guess, after supper, we were looking around at all the china sets that Christy and I have been given through the years, and we started talking about family heirlooms and then estate sales and how lucky we've been that ours have gone smoothly. But you hear horror stories about families that become filled with rage and hatred as they dispense goods. And I just said, you truly will see people at their very worst in those situations. Some of you may have experienced it. It is sickening. And that's why we need to be disgusted by what this younger son has done. Jesus obviously intends for him to represent the tax collectors and sinners, and we need to understand that through him what Jesus is saying about their condition. They are sinful. They are dishonoring their Father. They are pursuing selfish pleasures rather than a relationship with God. They don't care about God, only the stuff he gives to them. Sometimes we almost fall into a trap of romanticizing prodigals. Jesus will have none of that. To treat your father like this son did, by extension, to treat God like tax collectors and sinners were, is repulsive and it is shameful. Not to mention going far away, not to mention squandering your father's livelihood, not to mention finding yourself in the squalor of the pig pen. But that's not where this lost son's story ends. Just as we learned in the first couple of verses, tax collectors and sinners are drawing near to Jesus, the son in the story decides to return to his father's house. Jesus says in verse 17 that he came to himself. He got in his right mind. His heart toward his father changed because he's changed. And in his humility, he now recognizes that even slavery at home would be better than freedom far away from home. And true to form, guess how Jesus describes his homecoming? A great feast. Look at verse 20. He arose and came to his father. While he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to his father, "Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." And they began to celebrate. It's ironic that just as the father was as good as dead to the son, the way the son treated him, the son was as good as dead to the father because the father thought maybe he had lost him forever. It shows that his heart was not at all closed to his son. And now with his return and with the great joy of that return, it is time to party. Let us eat and celebrate. What the prodigal did was wrong. It was hard-heartedly wrong. But his heart softened, and he came home, and the father greeted him with a feast. When those who have been spiritually dead come back to life, it is time to rejoice. That's what Jesus wants the scribes and Pharisees to understand is happening. Tax collectors and sinners are coming home. Let's eat. It's time to party. In a group of this size, it is undoubtedly the case that we have in our midst some former prodigals, some disciples who at some point in the past stopped discipling, who stopped following Jesus, turned your heart away from him, ventured into the far country, thinking you could find something better. You may not have left your house to do that. In fact, you may have even filled a pew every Sunday, but you weren't with the Father. My mom went through a long period like this in her life. And when she returned to the Lord, and I was so grateful that she did, the summer before my junior year of high school, she was so overburdened by guilt that at this point in the service, at the Lord's Supper, she became very uncomfortable. What right do I have to share in this supper? After all, doesn't the Bible say that we're supposed to take it in a worthy manner? And indeed it does. But you know, this is one of those times when a little knowledge of grammar can go a long way spiritually. Paul doesn't say you have to be a worthy communer. He says you have to take communion in a worthy manner. It isn't the worshiper who is worthy, it's the worship that is worthy. I mean, if anybody actually thought, yeah, I think I've earned the right to come up here and commune with the Lord, that would be the one sure sign you're not worthy to take it. What Paul was condemning when he said to take the Lord's Supper in a worthy manner is that you shouldn't take it in the wrong way. You shouldn't take it in a way to score points against brothers and sisters, to display your great luxury and wealth, and to let others know they're not as rich as you. That is taking it in an unworthy manner. That's what was happening at Corinth. But it is only unworthy people who will ever take the Lord's Supper if you understand who you are and who he is. And this son knew that he was an unworthy son. He says it twice. He says it in what we read in verse 21, and he says it in what I skipped in verse 19. And that humility is the very reason he is back home, and that humility is the very reason he is eating the feast his father has prepared. Because it wasn't about how worthy the son was. It was about how gracious the Father is. And how joyful it is that a prodigal has come back home, that a son is where he is supposed to be. And just to double down on that, look again at the end of verse 24. And they began to celebrate. Well, with one exception. Verse 25, now his older son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing, and he called one of the servants and asked what these things meant, and he said to him, your brother's come home, and your father's killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound. But he was angry, refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, look, these many years I've served you, and I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who's devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. On the surface, this older son may seem as different as from the younger son as the scribes and Pharisees seemed from the tax collectors and sinners. But on further inspection, you will see that they have a great deal in common. Look carefully at verse 29. First thing he says, look, these many years I have served you. That is a curious way for a son to describe his relationship with his father. Not loved you, not honored you, served you. In fact, the word means servitude. It means slavery. That's why the New Living Translation says, all these years I've slaved for you. And not only is it odd that he says that his relationship with his father is one of a master and a slave, the very way he says it is rude to his father. Look, listen here. Remember, if you go back to verse 19, the younger son felt so unworthy to be a son that he wanted to be treated as a hired servant. Ironically, that is exactly how the older son perceives himself. He is a servant. He's just a slave, slaving away in the fields for his father. Notice something else he says in verse 29. And I never disobeyed a command of yours. That's quite a claim. I have never disobeyed. And what is astonishing is he's making that assertion at precisely the very moment he is disobeying the command of his father, which in verse 23 is, let's celebrate. And not only that, he's pouting to the point that his father actually has to go outside and talk to him and plead with him, which would have brought great shame upon a father in such a culture. Just like if you're out in public and one of your little kids starts throwing a temper tantrum right in front of everybody. He shamed his father just like the younger son did. And notice one more detail in verse 29. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. One of the pitiful details I skipped over because you know the story so well. But back in verse 16, it says of the younger son in the far country that no one gave him anything. That's exactly what the older son says about his father. You never even gave me a young goat, which is much less expensive than a fattened calf. I think I've used this illustration before, but it's like the older son is saying, he comes back home after all he did, and you take him to Ruth's Chris, and now you're just taking me to Golden Corral. This is not fair. What does this tell us, though, about the older brother's concept of serving his father? Why was he doing what he was doing? Only for what he could get from his father. It's not a father-son relationship to him. It's almost like a business partnership. He looked at his father only in terms of what he got from him. And you know who else did that? The younger son. Both boys were living for themselves. In the case of the prodigal, his self-centeredness led to self-indulgence. In the case of the older brother, his led to self-righteousness. But at the end of the day, they were both about self and not the father. So it turns out they're actually two lost sons. The one who left and the one who stayed. And for some of us, when we look at this story, we don't see in ourselves the younger son. We never had a dramatic prodigal period of immoral living like he did. But we do see ourselves in the older son. The same pettiness, the same ingratitude, the same misdirective motivation for service has nothing to do with loving the Father. And worst of all, the same disdain for those who have ever left. And when those feelings bubble back to the surface, they make us feel every bit as unworthy to take of this meal as the prodigals may feel. But here's the great thing about the Father in this story and about our Father in heaven. He hasn't given up on us Pharisees either. At the end of the story, he is still reasoning with the older son, imploring him to come in and eat. Verse 31, he said to him, son, not slave, son, you're always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. And you know, it might just be good to remember that not only did Jesus frequently eat with tax collectors and sinners, you know who else he ate with? He ate with Pharisees, like the one mentioned back in Luke 7, Simon the Pharisee. And like a lot of us who are here today. If you have a tender heart, it is only understandable that you feel a little uncomfortable at the Lord's table. But just remember, it's not about you. It is about him, about his love, about his grace, about his desire for a relationship, about his joy in those who have come back to him. And so, whether you are a former prodigal or a former Pharisee, put those doubts away. And in the words of the father of this story, let us eat and celebrate.